Today, we're taking you back to the early 1960s, to the island nation of Malta, and to a case that would leave a permanent mark on the country's collective memory. On a warm summer evening in Valletta in August of 1960, 8-year-old Anthony Twanny Aquilina was found dead inside his family's apartment. What followed was one of the most disturbing and closely followed trials in Maltese history, one that shocked the public, divided opinion, and raised questions that have never fully gone away. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the Brief Ledger, and join us as we carefully trace this case, step by step, exactly as the records reveal it. On a warm August evening in 1960, life in Malta was settling into its familiar rhythm. As the heat of the day slowly faded, residents emerged from their homes to enjoy the brief coolness that arrived with dusk. Conversations drifted through open windows, and the narrow streets of Valletta filled with the ordinary sounds of daily life drawing to a close. At the time, Malta was still part of the British Empire, a small archipelago in the central Mediterranean shaped by centuries of occupation and conflict. Though independence was only a few years away, British influence remained visible in daily life, from the presence of the military to the structures of law and governance. Valletta, the island's capital, was one of the smallest in Europe, densely populated and closely knit, a place where neighbors lived side by side and little went unnoticed. In a modest apartment just off a main road lived the Camilleri family. Giga Camilleri stayed at home caring for the children, while her husband Lely worked as a marine engineer connected to the British naval presence on the island. Giga had 2 children from a previous relationship: Anthony, known to everyone as Twanny, who was 8 years old, and his younger sister Carmen. The couple also shared a younger daughter, Maltese, just 3 years of age. Tuesday, the 23rd of August, began and ended like countless other summer days in Malta. At approximately 7:40 p.m., a police officer making his way through the streets of Valletta was approached by a visibly distressed man. Struggling to speak clearly, the man reported that a young boy had fallen and appeared to be unresponsive. The officer followed him to a nearby apartment building and climbed the shared stone staircase that led to the upper floor. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere was unnervingly quiet. In the kitchen, a young boy was found lying motionless on the floor. He was later identified as 8-year-old Anthony Twanny Aquilina. The officer quickly noted that the circumstances did not align with what he had been told. The nature of the injuries observed suggested that the child's death could not be explained by an accidental fall. Twanny's mother, Giga Camilleri, and his stepfather, Lely Camilleri, were present at the apartment. Both appeared extremely distressed, crying and calling out as neighbors gathered outside the building. No attempt was made at that moment to assign responsibility or determine how the child had died. The apartment was secured, and additional officers were called to the scene. What had initially been reported as a tragic accident was now treated as something far more serious. Before the night had ended, a formal investigation was underway, and the events of that evening would soon place the quiet Valletta neighborhood at the center of a case that would shock the nation. By the following morning, the news had traveled far beyond the narrow streets of Valletta. Word of the young boy's death moved quickly through the island, carried by neighbors, radio reports, and early newspaper coverage. In a country as small and tightly connected as Malta, events of this nature were impossible to contain. Valletta was a place where daily life unfolded in full view of others. Doors were left open to catch the evening air, voices carried easily through shared walls, and residents were keenly aware of what happened around them. As details of the previous night began to circulate, disbelief gave way to quiet outrage. Many struggled to accept that such an event could occur in what was widely regarded as a peaceful and orderly community. Police presence remained visible around the apartment building throughout the day. The staircase and surrounding areas were secured as investigators continued their work, and the initial suggestion of an accidental fall was formally set aside. Authorities now treated the death as suspicious, and the seriousness of the situation became increasingly clear. As the hours passed, public attention intensified. Questions were raised not only about how the boy had died, but how such a tragedy could have gone unnoticed until it was too late. It was evident that this case would not fade from public memory, and that pressure would continue to mount until clear answers were provided. As with most serious crimes involving a child, investigators began by examining the home itself. With the apartment secured and the surrounding area under observation, attention turned to those who had last been with Twanny Aquilina before his death. Giga Camilleri and her husband Lely were questioned separately by police. Their statements were taken in a calm and methodical manner, recorded as part of the routine procedures that followed any unexplained death. At this stage, no accusations were made and no conclusions were drawn. Giga stated that she had been away from the apartment during the afternoon and early evening, spending time outside the home with her daughters. She maintained that she was not present when anything occurred and said she only returned later, when she discovered something was wrong. Lely, for his part, told investigators that he had been out running errands at the time and was not inside the apartment when Twanny was injured. Both denied any involvement in the boy's death. With no direct evidence yet linking either of them to what had occurred, no immediate charges were brought. The investigation continued under growing public attention, and officers were careful to proceed step by step. As the inquiry progressed, it became clear that resolving the unanswered questions would require experience beyond local resources. A decision was made to seek outside assistance, marking the next phase of the investigation. In a building where sound traveled easily, neighbors began to recall details they had not initially understood. As investigators moved beyond the apartment itself, attention turned to those who had been inside the building during the late afternoon and early evening hours. Statements were taken from residents living on the same staircase. Some recalled hearing movement in the shared areas, while others spoke of sounds that, at the time, had not seemed unusual. In a place where footsteps and voices were part of everyday life, it was only later that these moments took on significance. One child living nearby told investigators that she had seen Twanny in the common area earlier that day. Her account placed him outside the apartment for a brief period, though she could not say what had led up to it. An adult guardian later offered a different recollection of that afternoon, stating that she had not been present, a claim that would later be questioned as her account changed. A teenage neighbor described seeing Twanny being carried up the stairs. He said the boy appeared still, though he did not intervene and initially reported nothing to police. Another statement placed Twanny back inside the apartment later that evening, before authorities arrived. Individually, the accounts were uncertain. Taken together, they allowed investigators to begin assembling a narrow timeline, shaped not by certainty, but by proximity and memory. While witnesses described what they believed they had seen, doctors were tasked with determining what could be proven. Court-appointed medical examiners examined Twanny Aquilina's body in order to establish how and when he had died, and whether the explanation first offered to police could be supported by physical evidence. Their findings narrowed the window of time in which death had occurred, placing it within the late afternoon to early evening hours. The injuries observed were determined to be inconsistent with an accidental fall, leading investigators to formally rule out that possibility. Medical testimony further indicated that Twanny had suffered harm prior to the fatal moment, suggesting that his death was the culmination of events rather than the result of a single incident. Examiners also noted indications that the child had been moved after being injured. Traces consistent with bodily injury were identified within the apartment, as well as in shared areas of the building, including parts of the stairwell. These findings supported witness accounts that placed Twanny in more than one location during the final period before his death. The medical evidence did not identify who was responsible for the injuries. What it did provide was clarity. The death was neither sudden nor accidental. As the examination results were added to the growing body of testimony, investigators were once again directed back toward the household, where the remaining questions now waited to be answered. When the trial opened in February 1961, Malta realized the case would be far more disturbing than first believed. On the 25th of that month, Giga and Lely Camilleri were brought before a jury, and proceedings began under intense public and press scrutiny. From the outset, it was clear that this would not be a brief or routine hearing. Over the course of 17 days, the court heard testimony from more than 100 witnesses, making it the longest jury trial in Maltese history at the time. Each day added further detail to a picture that steadily unsettled those in attendance. The courtroom was often filled, and reports of the proceedings were followed closely across the island. Teachers who had known Twanny Aquilina during his short life gave evidence under oath. They spoke of repeated signs of injury observed while he was at school, and of a child who appeared withdrawn and physically slight for his age. Neighbors were called to describe what they had seen and heard in the weeks and months leading up to his death. Medical experts presented their findings, linking the injuries observed after death to earlier harm. Throughout the trial, the defense maintained that neither Giga nor Lely Camilleri had caused the boy's death. Both continued to deny wrongdoing, as the court listened to testimony that challenged the image of an ordinary family life inside the apartment. The most decisive account did not come from an adult, but from inside the family itself. Late in the trial, the court heard testimony from Carmen Aquilina, Twanny's sister, who was called to describe what she remembered of the day her brother died. Speaking under oath, Carmen recounted events inside the apartment during the afternoon hours. She described Twanny being disciplined earlier that day and recalled him leaving the apartment shortly afterward. According to her testimony, he was later brought back inside, appearing unresponsive. She told the court that she had been instructed to fetch her stepfather from outside the home and that he returned shortly thereafter. Carmen's account placed both Giga and Lely Camilleri inside the apartment during the period in question. She further testified that Twanny's body was moved within the kitchen area following his return. The court also heard evidence relating to clothing and household items, including garments that had been changed and placed into a washing machine. Investigators stated that traces consistent with bodily injury were later identified in connection with these items. The defense challenged Carmen's testimony, raising questions about her age and reliability. However, no alternative explanation was offered that accounted for the sequence of events she described. By the time her testimony concluded, the jury had been presented with a version of events that brought together witness statements, medical findings, and actions inside the apartment, forming the core of the prosecution's case. After 17 days of testimony, the responsibility of judgment passed to the jury. Having heard witness accounts, medical evidence, and sworn statements presented by both the prosecution and the defense, the court prepared to deliver its decision. The jury returned a unanimous verdict. Giga Camilleri and Lely Camilleri were both found guilty of the murder of Anthony Twanny Aquilina. Sentencing followed in accordance with Maltese law as it stood at the time. Lely Camilleri was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment with hard labor. Giga Camilleri received the death sentence, a decision that reflected the gravity with which the court viewed the case. In the weeks that followed, an appeal was submitted on Giga Camilleri's behalf. The appeal was successful, and her sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment. The decision drew widespread attention and was closely followed by the public, many of whom had remained deeply engaged with the case since the trial began. Giga Camilleri did not serve a full life sentence. After approximately 10 years in custody, she was released from prison. The circumstances surrounding her release were not made public, and no official explanation was issued at the time. With that, the courtroom phase of the case came to an end, though its presence in Maltese society did not. For many, the verdict should have marked the end of the story, but it did not. In the years that followed the trial, the case of Anthony Twanny Aquilina returned periodically to public attention, not through new evidence, but through memory and later testimony. After her release from prison, Giga Camilleri continued to maintain her innocence. In a later interview, she described herself as a grieving mother and spoke of Twanny in religious terms, referring to him as a martyr and a saint. In her home, images of her son were displayed prominently, including the photograph taken on the day of his first Holy Communion. That image, showing Twanny dressed in white, became inseparably linked to the case, and remained instantly recognizable to many in Malta. Decades later, Carmen Aquilina, who had given the testimony that proved decisive at trial, publicly stated that her account had not been truthful. She claimed that what she had said in court was false and suggested that responsibility for her brother's death lay elsewhere. Her statement reignited discussion around a case long thought to be settled. Despite these claims, no retrial was ordered and the convictions were never overturned. The apartment in Valletta where Twanny died was never reoccupied, remaining silent as years passed. More than half a century later, the case continues to linger, unresolved, contested, and deeply embedded in Malta's collective memory.